In April 1952, at the Soviet air base of Antung, located in China near the Korean border, a group of Soviet officers landed. The group was under the command of the well-known General Alexei Blagoveshchensky, who at the time was none other than the head of the Soviet Air Force Flight Research Center. His group included a team of 12 MiG pilots, and not just any pilots, but highly skilled test pilots from the same Flight Research Center. As the general reported to the head of the airbase, his group had arrived with a special task: to hunt down and capture an American F-86 Sabre. On the 25th of June 1950, the North Korean army launched a massive and unexpected attack on South Korea in an attempt to unite the peninsula. The North was under communist control, which of course automatically meant they were peaceful and had no intention of fighting. They simply couldn't stand watching their southern brothers suffer under the damned capitalists. And as any good communist would know, there was only one proper solution: to liberate the South and reunite with their brothers. The fact that the Southern brothers fiercely resisted this noble cause was, by communist logic, merely a temporary misunderstanding that could be resolved by killing more of them, or perhaps all of them, if that's what it took to live together as brothers. Sadly, today, such an approach no longer sounds shocking and is seen as acceptable not only in Russia but even in some Western countries. Back then, however, things were different. After the communist aggression, the United Nations organization did not waste time issuing hollow statements or expressing deep concern. Instead, it took decisive action, most notably through Resolution 84, which authorized the United States to form and lead a unified command of United Nations member forces to halt North Korean aggression. It may sound almost like fiction today, but those measures reflected the West's clear understanding that aggression must be crushed swiftly and decisively at its outset, a hard lesson paid for with tens of millions of lives during the Second World War. Looking at today's world, it's hard to escape the feeling that this lesson was learned in vain. Anyway, the arrival of United Nations forces in South Korea helped turn the tide, and the communists were soon forced into a hasty retreat, finding themselves on the brink of complete defeat. The North was saved by its big brothers. China sent over 1 million heads of cannon fodder, while the USSR provided more sophisticated assistance, such as air defense support, by quickly forming the 64th Fighter Air Corps, equipped with MiG-15 fighters, and sending them to Korea. Well, not exactly to Korea, but to China, conveniently close to the Korean border, so that the USSR, that greatest country in the world, boldly claiming to fear no enemies, couldn't be officially accused of helping its allies. You see, when it came to real action, Russians had invented and mastered to perfection the so-called burrito strategy. The appearance in Korea of the Soviets' most advanced MiG-15 fighters quickly had an effect, first and foremost by disrupting US bombing operations carried out by B-26 and B-29 bombers, which, though shocking, was hardly surprising, as the World War II-era piston-engine bombers stood little chance against modern jet fighters. The inferior US F-80 and F-84 jet fighters could offer no serious resistance to the MiG either. Overall, everything seemed to confirm the words of the renowned Andrei Tupolev that the MiG-15 was undoubtedly the best aircraft in the world. The difficulties for the Soviets began with the arrival in Korea of the newest US fighter, the F-86 Sabre, whose pilots apparently weren't aware of Tupolev's bold declaration. To be fair, neither were the Soviet pilots, nor Tupolev himself, since it would be nearly 30 years before the release of Mikhail Arlazorov's book, in which he simply invented this fake Tupolev quote about the MiG-15 fighter. I'm bringing up Arlazorov's book here not only because it describes the first combat engagements between MiGs and Sabres, but also because it's one of the most amusing examples of what we might call the Russian way of delivering historical information. According to Arlazorov, the MiG's first fights against the Sabres in Korea, quote, revealed something that couldn't have been discovered during test flights, specifically the so-called Valyoshka, or wing drop, a sudden and uncontrollable spin that often led to an unrecoverable stall and loss of the plane. Now, I obviously can't speak for everyone, but I have a strong belief that anyone with at least a positive number IQ would immediately ask, what do you mean the uncontrollable spin couldn't have been discovered during test flights? That's literally the entire point of test flights, to identify and fix flight performance issues before the aircraft is accepted into service. And it's not just me saying this, the very same Mikhail Arlazorov expressed exactly this opinion himself. No, not in another book or a different chapter, but right here on the very same page, just a few paragraphs above. Arlazorov writes that during the MiG-15's flight testing, a serious problem was discovered: a violent, uncontrollable spin. The issue appeared so severe that, according to the author, wind tunnel experiments alone weren't enough to solve it. A team of test pilots had to step in to pinpoint the cause and find a solution. And when the work was completed, those same test pilots unanimously reported the MiG-15 is a top-class fighter that must be put into service immediately. The MiG entered service and apparently everything was fine right up until the Korean War began, which, by the way, according to Arlazorov, started with an attack by South Korea, not North Korea, as many of you might think. And then, all of a sudden, the first air battles revealed the MiG's tendency for unexpected spin, something that flight testing couldn't discover. I'm telling you, sometimes I think all Russian historical books, articles and documentaries apparently come with a built-in neuralizer, like in the Men in Black movies, that erases your memory after reading each paragraph. Otherwise, no sane person could possibly comprehend them. Jumping a bit ahead, the MiG's wing drop problem, caused by the wings warping at high speeds due to structural flaws, would never be fully resolved. It remained with the MiG-15 throughout its entire service life and cost many Soviet pilots their lives, both in combat and during training flights. The early solution to the problem, as mentioned in Arlazorov's book, was essentially nothing more than prohibiting pilots from flying at maximum speed, the very range where this tendency to stall had been occurring. While such a restriction wasn't too difficult to follow during training, it was a completely different story in the heat of combat, which is why the wing drop issue inevitably resurfaced once again over Korea. In any case, the wing drop, although deadly, wasn't the only issue that Soviet MiG pilots asked to be addressed after their first encounters with American Sabres. Following the first month of air combat, General Lobov, commander of the 64th Fighter Air Corps, sent a report to the Ministry of Defense outlining urgent measures needed to improve the MiG-15's combat effectiveness. Lobov's recommendations were taken very seriously and acted upon promptly. By December 1951, the Ministry of Defense, together with the Ministry of Aircraft Industry, reported to the Soviet Council of Ministers on the implementation of the requested improvements to the MiG-15, ranging from repainting the fighters in darker colors to installing an additional ejection control lever for the left hand, since it turned out that some Soviet pilots wounded in the right hand had died unable to eject. I also wanted to mention one thing on Lobov's list that I personally find quite interesting: the request for a recording delay on the MiG's gun camera. It appears that up until that point, the gun camera on Soviet fighters stopped recording the moment the pilot released the trigger, meaning the shells fired hadn't yet reached their target and the actual impacts were never captured on film, which might explain why we don't see much Soviet gun camera footage showing any real hits, considering that by this time gun cameras had already been in use for more than a decade. Such a technical oversight seems downright ridiculous. Anyway, all these requests for improvements to the MiG were based on the pilots' first encounters with Sabres and on assumptions about their flight characteristics. The best way to effectively counter the F-86, of course, was to learn its real performance characteristics through flight testing of the actual aircraft. The problem, of course, was getting the actual aircraft. But the Soviets came up with a daring plan to do just that. When you need to build an effective strategy for fighting enemy aircraft, no matter how good your analysis or assumptions are, there is no better way to do it than to test the actual aircraft and learn its characteristics firsthand. So it's no surprise that after encountering the US Sabre, the Soviets were determined to get their hands on the American fighter for study. And to be fair, there was nothing wrong with that desire. The Americans wanted the same thing. The only difference was in chosen methods to achieve the goal. While the US offered $100,000 reward to any defector who could fly a MiG-15 to an American base, the top brass of the Soviet command came up with a different idea: to capture an American F-86 by forcing it to land at a Soviet airfield. How do I know the idea came from the high command? Because out of all the officers of this special team sent to Korea to hunt the Sabre, literally no one had even the slightest idea how to actually do that. In Soviet books and pilot memoirs, this group is usually referred to either as the Group of Blagoveshensky after its commander, or more often as the Zubenka team, named after Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Zubenka, who oversaw all flight operations and commanded the pilots. And not just pilots, but top-notch test pilots from the Soviet Air Force Flight Research Center. The problem, however, was that excellent piloting skills didn't automatically translate into great combat skills. The situation was made even worse by the fact that the group leader was overconfident in his own abilities. According to Colonel Yevgeny Pepelayev, commander of the 196th Regiment, to which the special team was formally assigned, after the fights against the Sabres, all his regiment pilots knew that Sabre had a higher maximum speed, and if an American pilot wanted to quit the fight and break away from a MiG, he could do it at any moment. Under those conditions, Pepelayev said, you could damage or shoot down the F-86, you could kill or wound the pilot, but to force it to land was pure fluff. And yet, despite that, Lieutenant Colonel Zubenka outright refused Pepelayev's offer to share his combat experience and conduct joint training. The results of this overconfidence, however, proved tragic. In their very first encounter with the Sabres, despite having the advantage of 12 MiGs against 10 F-86, the Zubenka group lost one pilot killed and had two other MiGs damaged, without scoring a single victory. After this embarrassing defeat, the command of the special group finally realized that its pilots were not ready for combat in Korea. They grounded all flights and at last turned to the 196th Fighter Aviation Regiment for assistance. After several tactical lessons conducted by Colonel Pepelayev, the group decided to resume flying, yet on their very first training flight, they once again suffered losses, this time losing the head of the group, quite literally. During a landing approach after a training flight, Lieutenant Colonel Zubenka made a piloting error that caused his aircraft to flip over, sliding down the runway and shearing off everything protruding from the fuselage, including the tail, the canopy, and Zubenka's head. Tragic, but that's not all. I simply cannot resist telling this story, especially in light of the most ridiculous myth that Russians honor and respect their fallen heroes. The thing is that after the tragic loss of Lieutenant Colonel Zubenka's head, the Soviet command somehow lost Zubenka's remaining part as well. Once again, literally. Zubenka's family was informed that he had died, but where, how, under what circumstances, and even where his body was, none of that was ever disclosed. And no, it wasn't a matter of secrecy as one might assume. The Soviet command genuinely didn't know where Zubenka's body had gone. And let me remind you that we're not talking about some Russian peasant or a soldier who were never counted in Russia, but rather about a high-ranking officer, Lieutenant Colonel, the chief test pilot of the Soviet Air Force Flight Research Center. It wasn't until 2002, more than 50 years later, that Zubenka's family managed to find out about his participation in combat operations in Korea. But still, no one knew where his body had gone. It wasn't until 2015, by sheer chance, in the godforsaken Russian city of Ussurisk, on the grounds of some sugar factory, that Zubenka's grave was accidentally discovered. It drew attention because it stood out from the other abandoned graves. Now, I will leave aside the question of why on the grounds of a sugar factory there is not just one abandoned grave but an entire cemetery. I just want to talk about the article that gloriously reported on finding the missing Russian hero. A funny thing, by the way, that to the local authorities, finding the lost grave of a high-ranking officer considered a hero did not justify moving his body from a sugar factory to the town's central cemetery. I want to point your attention to something else. The article clearly describes the circumstances of Lieutenant Colonel Zubenka's death during a training flight. And right below that description, there is a photograph of Zubenka's tombstone with a large inscription saying, "Killed in action." Remember when I said you'd need a neuralizer constantly raising your memory while reading Russian articles? You thought I was joking, didn't you? After the loss of Lieutenant Colonel Zubenka, his group was disbanded, marking the failure of the first Soviet attempt to acquire a Sabre. However, the USSR eventually did get its hands on one, this time by sheer luck. On October 6, 1951, the previously mentioned Colonel Yevgeny Pepelayev managed to damage an American F-86 with cannon fire. One of his shells struck the Sabre right behind the canopy, damaging the ejection mechanism. The American pilot was forced to make an emergency landing and was quickly evacuated by a rescue helicopter, but the aircraft itself was captured by North Korean forces and soon transported to Moscow for study. What Soviets didn't know back then, of course, is that this particular captured Sabre was actually quite a special aircraft. The thing is, several months earlier, this very Sabre, number 319, had already made history. It was the aircraft flown by Captain James Jabara on May 20, 1951, when in a battle against MiGs he scored his 5th and 6th victories, becoming the first American jet ace. A few months later, on October 6, 1951, that same Sabre took off for MiG Alley once again, this time piloted by Captain Gil Garrett, who was unlucky enough to encounter one of the best Soviet aces of the Korean War, Colonel Pepelayev, and was shot down. But that's not all. The thing is, in modern Russia, this Sabre has somehow become the basis for claiming that on October 6, Pepelayev shot down none other than America's first jet ace, Captain Jabara, and that the Americans are simply covering it up. The irony is that such claims aren't made by some random YouTubers, say, like me, but by one of Russia's most popular aviation historians, the author of numerous books and a frequent guest expert in dozens of aviation documentaries, Nikolai Bodrikhin. The funny part is that you don't even have to be a professional historian to debunk this nonsense. The fact is that at the time Sabre 319 was shot down, Captain Jabara was on a publicity tour across the United States, something that is well known and documented in dozens of photographs and videos.
Captain James Jabara of the USAF, the first jet ace the world has ever known, an inspiration to his colleagues and free men everywhere in the fight against aggression.
But apparently for today's Russian historians, that's still not quite enough evidence. Anyway, you know what happens next. The F-86 was delivered to the Central Air Hydrodynamic Institute, the TSAGI, for detailed examination. Within 4 months, the study of the captured F-86 was completed, and on June 19, 1952, the Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Air Force, Pavel Zhigarev, together with Mikhail Hrunichev, the Minister of Aircraft Industry, reported to the head of the Soviet government with proposals for implementing the results of the F-86 study and recommendations for adoption by domestic aircraft industry and the Air Force. Among the proposals were copying the American radar gun sight, larger air brakes, installing a redundant control system, replicating aviation fuel and hydraulic fluids, and even introducing the so-called G-suit. It is important to note that the report on the F-86 submitted to the Soviet government merely proposed that Soviet industry adopt and utilize certain components, technologies, and materials learned from the captured American aircraft. But the great and wise leader Joseph Stalin had a different opinion regarding the American fighter, one that was short and simple. But that will be the topic for the next video. The Soviet hunt for the Sabre was both intense and rewarding, as it was arguably the only moment in history when the USSR managed to acquire a truly up-to-date American fighter aircraft and thus study its rivals' aviation technologies. The next such opportunity wouldn't come up until 1975, when the USSR obtained a flight-ready Northrop F-5 Tiger for evaluation. Looking at the flight performance figures alone, the F-5 appeared far inferior to the Soviet MiG-21, let alone the MiG-23. And yet, after putting the F-5 through mock dogfights against those Soviet fighters, the results turned out to be absolutely surprising, and not in a good way for the Russians. Yet another fascinating story from Soviet aviation history, which you can learn about in my video available exclusively on my streaming service Nebula. Nebula is where I, along with a growing community of creators, release original, thoughtful, and ad-free content on important topics that often get overlooked or even censored elsewhere. It's a space for high-quality, in-depth videos that explore these subjects without the usual platform restrictions. With Nebula, you will get early access to my videos and exclusive content you won't find anywhere else, like the story of the Soviet MiG pilot who accidentally landed on a NATO airfield, or the ghost flight when a Soviet transport plane circled for hours over a city with an entirely unconscious crew. And it's not just my content. Nebula features dozens of unique projects like Epic History, Battle of Britain by Real Engineering, Mad Kings by Real Life Lore, and one of my personal favorites, MiG Hunters by Mustard. These projects wouldn't be possible without the support of Nebula subscribers, because Nebula is different. It was built and is owned by the creators themselves, making it the most sustainable way to support our work. When you sign up using my link in the description, I receive a portion of your subscription fee for as long as you stay subscribed. That support helps us continually improve our content, and for you, it means no ads, no sponsorship interruptions, just pure, thoughtful video content. So if you want to support creators who still put truth and effort over clicks and algorithms, and get access to some of the best documentaries on the internet, go to nebula.tv/paperskies, or click the link in the description, or scan the QR code on screen to sign up. You will get 40% off an annual subscription. That's just $36 a year or $3 a month. Or you can choose a lifetime membership, which allows you to pay only once to get unlimited access forever. And with my link, you can get $200 off of Nebula lifetime plan. So click the link and go watch my Back in the USSR video, available now on Nebula.